Hi everyone, welcome back. So some of you who have seen some of my previous videos or subscribed to my channel will know that I've previously talked about massage for domestic abuse, massage for PTSD, and how PTSD relates to chronic pain and some skin conditions. I've also talked about how Yoni massage can help those who have been through particularly any form of sexual abuse and have unresolved trauma. And I've also done a video on neurogenic tremors, which can exhibit themselves when, again, there has been stored trauma in the body. So if you've not already seen those and you find this video helpful, do take a look at those other videos because they will link in very well with what I'm going to talk about today. I wanted really to do this video. A lot of you, I'm sure, will know from my previous videos, or if you've been my client, I myself suffer with PTSD. So this is something that I specialise in with my work. It's something that I teach, and I wanted really to do a video where I talk a bit more in depth about the physiological effect of trauma, because everyone quite often automatically assumes that it's a psychological issue, which of course it's not. So I'm going to show why that's the case in this video. So I'm going to start off by talking about the effect of trauma on our bodies. So when we live with trauma that is untreated, sometimes even unrecognised as being there, this can lead to various medical conditions, and while the symptoms will vary from in each individual case, there are certainly some symptoms that are more universal and do tend to arise in the majority of cases. And so these can be things like inability to work, inability to sleep, maybe quite often I hear from clients they'll be seeing specialists for various issues, but they don't get a diagnosis. They might have lots of tests and there's no diagnosis. There's no reason found for the issues that they're experiencing. They may have extended recovery time after illness, but they may get headaches, just general, aches throughout the body. Maybe they're having a very healthy diet, they're doing lots of exercise, but they still can't lose weight and they're still getting health problems. Certainly a lot of chronic conditions can arise and have been linked with trauma. So we're talking about things like chronic pain, which I've talked about previously, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, autoimmune conditions, so things sort of like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, migraines, IBS, severe PMS, and of course anxiety and depression. We also see other common sort of universal symptoms of things like fatigue and just generally feeling overwhelmed, feeling numb, dissociated or disembodied, particularly with PTSD. The person may have trouble focusing, possibly sort of in a more sort of terms of relationships and things. They may have irrational fears. They may feel that they have problems setting boundaries. They therefore end up staying in toxic relationships and end up repeating this pattern. Often, this will be because they have a lack of self-confidence, a lack of self-worth. they will find it difficult to, they'll have difficulty in moving forward in life. And also a lot of people may find that they're quite accident prone as well. So all of these things tend to be fairly universal in people suffering with unresolved trauma. So why are these things sort of happening? What is happening in the body, in our physiology, that increases the risk of all these associated conditions? So usually when something stressful happens in our life, we do what we need to survive, and then we heal and carry on with our life. But in those of us who have untreated trauma, we spend too much time living just in survival mode, and then we don't spend enough time in healing mode. So that's why we see these extended recovery periods after illness or injury. So we're going to talk about the stress response and what happens in the body when we go through trauma. So the autonomic nervous system is basically there to protect us from outside threats and dangers, to keep us safe, and it will trigger three main responses during times of stress. And so these are called fight, flight, or freeze response. So you can see here, so most of us know about the fight or flight response. So these are basically controlled by the sympathetic nervous system, which is part of the autonomic nervous system. So when a trauma happens, we basically can either fight whatever the threat is. So we may respond with irritability, anger, aggression, and we'll move towards that threat. We'll fight it. Or we may go the opposite route and go through the flight response, again controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. And here we'll, rather than getting angry and aggressive, we experience anxiety and fear and panic. So we go into avoiding that threat. We run, we flee from the situation. And this can cause a lot of chronic worry and sort of perfectionist tendencies. However, if we can't go through the fight or flight for whatever reason, maybe we're in an abusive situation and we're unable to run because maybe our movement is being restricted, but we're too scared to fight. Then we go into the third response, which is the freeze response. So this is where we get stuck. We're literally immobilized and we dissociate from what's going on. And this can lead to depression. Now there is also a fourth stress response, which we see this more following the trauma and in terms of how we deal with what's happened. And this is called the fawn response. So this is where we fall into those people-pleasing behaviours. We avoid conflict, we put others before our own needs, we have problems saying no, and we have problems setting boundaries. So whenever we find ourselves in an unsafe or dangerous environment, when we feel under threat, what happens is our autonomic nervous system kicks in and we enter that fight or flight stress response. But as I've just said, if we feel helpless or unable for whatever reason to either fight the threat or flee and run away from it, then we enter that freeze response and our system shuts down because we can't cope with what is going on. When this happens, we therefore enter a more primitive area of the autonomic nervous system. And this is so that we are then able to basically numb ourselves to those feelings that are so difficult to cope with. And we just kind of switch ourselves off. Now, the effect of this freeze response can remain in the body for years, for the rest of our life sometimes, which means that those fight or flight hormones, the adrenaline, the cortisol, they're still circulating in our system with nowhere to go. And in a lot of us, we may not even be aware that this is happening. We may not even recognize that we have suffered trauma because we've just suppressed all those emotions. But even if we are aware, we may often struggle to find a healthy way to release all those stress hormones so that we can overcome, the trauma. So the autonomic nervous system, which controls this stress response, controls all automatic body responses. So we're talking about things like the immune system, digestive functioning, blood pressure responses, internal fluid regulation. And when the autonomic nervous system remains in this state of high alert, these basic automatic functions may not work properly, which means that when we then go through another traumatic experience, our system just gets overloaded and we then see a deterioration in our health. And we see the introduction of issues that we talked about at the beginning of this video. And this quite often is why we see teenagers having nervous breakdowns, because they've been through some previous trauma and it's just either not been recognized or it's been suppressed, or maybe sort of the parents think, well, okay, they've dealt with that, they seem to be all right now. But they're not okay, because all these stress hormones are still circulating, and so there's just one other thing that happens that just pushes them over the edge. So when our bodies stay in this survival mode for a long time, all of our body systems can be affected by this. So, how we digest food, how we recover from illness and injuries because the immune system is then not working as it should, how we process information, how we relate to others, how we decide what we want out of life, setting boundaries, how we tap into our own creative potential, how well we tolerate others' behaviour, or how we empathise with other people. So if we constantly live in this survival mode, all of our energy is literally drained just on surviving, just on carrying on every day, because the body isn't equipped to deal with these constant high levels of stress. So somewhere along the line, it has to compensate and it has to shut down certain functions so that we can literally just stay alive. The fight or flight response, certainly it has its use, but it is intended as a short-term response during that time of trauma. But in activating that primitive part of the autonomic nervous system, because we want to kind of numb ourselves to those sort of difficult emotions that we're unable to handle at the time, by activating this more primitive part of the autonomic nervous system, our basic functioning will not be as it should be. So this is why a lot of trauma victims will often have issues with their short-term memory. They may not have the capacity to feel certain sensations in their body, and this is all due to that adrenaline and post-traumatic stress being trapped in the nervous system with nowhere to go. So this means, as we've said, that the body is less able to heal itself because the trauma has contributed to biological processes shutting down and has interfered with our homeostasis, that balance, in our internal environment. So in order to overcome all this, we have to learn somehow to process the stress correctly with the right practices, and in this way we can then allow our brain to develop and change so that we can restore that homeostasis. Now, when we are in this survival mode, what is happening is our autonomic nervous system and our brain are almost like in conflict with each other, because the nervous system is helping to protect us from these perceived threats, whereas the brain is preventing us from releasing those stress hormones, that would protect us from those threats. So we stay stuck in this survival response, with restricted access to the more evolved part of the autonomic nervous system, and we have to be able to regulate the autonomic nervous system so that when these stressful events happen, we can respond, but instead of remaining at that peak arousal stage of that fight or flight stress response, we're instead able to respond in a healthy way to deal with the stress and then deactivate, meaning that we return to a baseline level, we enter an open state of awareness of what is going on, we deal with it, and our body can then move on and respond to whatever is going to happen next. Now, through some reprogramming and somatic intervention, we can regulate the autonomic nervous system and return to a relaxed state. This will enable us to heal at a cellular level. It will enable us to form healthy social connections and enables this higher brain function that then allows our physiological symptoms to basically regulate themselves and work as they should. Because we have to remember it's the body, not the thoughts, that are activated and shut down. So it's the body that we need to treat. This is why in so many cases of PTSD and trauma, this is why talking therapies alone, they're not going to work. EMDR, which is in some cases very successful, in some cases not. And this again is because it's addressing that psychology, it's addressing the symptoms of the trauma, not the root cause. It's like if you were going to treat someone, with sciatica, for example, you could give a general Swedish massage, which, through release of endorphins and all that, it can help with the pain. It can help with pain management. But if that sciatica is being caused by, say, a tight piriformis muscle, unless you get in there and you release the tension in that piriformis muscle, the sciatica is going to continue. So it's not going to be a particularly effective treatment. So in the same way, with trauma and PTSD, You need to treat that root cause, not just the symptom. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the dysregulation of the nervous system, because, you know, so often we think trauma stems from this event, whatever the event may be. But it doesn't stem from the event. It stems from the reduced ability of the autonomic nervous system to properly regulate bodily functions in order to heal. And this is known as nervous system dysregulation. When we need to heal from something, the nervous system needs to be able to regulate itself, and therefore needs to be able to allow all of our bodily systems to connect with each other. And the earlier it's able to do this, then the earlier stress is released, and the earlier a person will be functioning more efficiently and be able to heal from the trauma. So what does that mean? Well, healing from the trauma means that we can experience restorative sleep. We can experience improved digestive function. We can have an efficient immune system that allows us again to heal. And we can genuinely feel more in control of what's going on. So, obviously, saying that we need to sort of regulate the nervous system as early as possible, that's all very well, but it's easier said than done. And you know, if we look at the different types of trauma, again, how quickly we can you know, deal with what's going on, and how quickly we can get that nervous system into a regulated state will really vary according to what type of trauma it is that we've experienced. So what are the different types of trauma? So we've got basic shock. So this could be something like if you've been in a car accident, if you've been through some kind of natural disaster, or if you've been through maybe physical or sexual abuse, certainly over the age of 5. It could be that there's accumulated stress, which, you know, just as with muscle tension, it can be a gradual build up to the point that we almost don't realise it's happening, because it just kind of happens so slowly that it becomes our norm. So it could be maybe overtime due to our work environment, or, you know, just a build up of life issues, you know, and obviously if we're not getting enough sleep as well, that's also going to have a knock-on effect on how we deal with those life issues. Trauma can be medical trauma, so it could be something like you know, having a near-death experience if you're in a coma or under anaesthetic. You know, maybe you've had a particularly traumatic treatment experience. If you have experienced date rape while unconscious, these can all come under medical. And probably the most common type of trauma, and probably one of the hardest to overcome, is early and developmental trauma. So we're talking stuff that happens under the age of 5 years old, or even when you are in utero. And this will incorporate a whole variety of issues, including, so if we start at in utero stresses, so we're talking about things, anything that causes a stress response in the mother. All of those stress hormones are also potentially going to affect the fetus. It could be trauma at the time of birth, so particularly forceps delivery, or maybe if there is something like a shoulder dystocia that is particularly difficult to manage, so where during delivery, as the baby comes down the birth canal and the shoulder gets stuck under that pelvic bone. It could be that there has been a premature birth which resulted in incubation. Maybe, quite often toddlers will have a health scare like a choking episode. Sometimes this can be a one-off thing, but it can be quite traumatic. Medical procedures, under the age of 5, surgeries, neglect, and of course physical and sexual abuse. So this is certainly the most common type of trauma, and it originates from a lack of secure attachment in those early years, or healthy attunement from a parent or a caregiver. And attachment is almost certainly affected by the parent's health and their ability to bond. So this is known as co-regulation. So, for example, we often see parents who have been abused may be, have unresolved trauma themselves and be unable to express love in a healthy way. Maybe, are unsure of how to really bond with their child. Now, to an infant, getting their needs met in a safe environment is essential to their early development, because their autonomic nervous system isn't matured in the same way, as ours is when we're adults or even teenagers. So they're not able to self-regulate. They're not able to turn off these survival responses and return to that baseline state after something traumatic has happened, because their autonomic nervous system just isn't mature enough. It doesn't have the capacity to do that. And so it's very difficult for them to then activate the more evolved part of the autonomic nervous system. So they stay stuck in this stress response and in that primitive part of the autonomic nervous system. And this means that it's very difficult for them to feel safe and to connect with others as any other, child who hasn't been through trauma would. Without without that attachment, without a highly attuned caregiver, the more evolved part of the autonomic nervous system will not function properly because of this lack of attachment. And so consequently, the levels of this survival stress and the levels of circulating stress hormones in the body remain high. Now, we know that the neural networks in the brain, they have the capacity to grow and to kind of remap themselves, allowing for systematic, adjustments, which can include activation of this more evolved portion of the autonomic nervous system. And the Adverse Childhood Experience, or ACE study, actually showed a correlation between early childhood stress and adult health. It showed that, adverse childhood experiences and this early developmental trauma can certainly increase the risk later on of cancer, chronic illness, heart disease, mental illness. Those children are more likely to grow up and experience violence and abuse, or potentially even have violent and aggressive tendencies themselves, because they don't have the capacity to deal with certain experiences in life. So they react in an aggressive manner. There's also been shown to be a link between early and developmental trauma and increased use of the NHS, increased health service costs, increased criminal justice costs, whether that be because they have fallen into criminal behaviours themselves, or maybe they have been the victim of something like abuse themselves, you know, growing up. And so there's certainly a link with higher social and economic issues, as well as, you know, medical issues. And this study also showed, you know, that it's not the type of trauma that's important, just the fact that they have experienced childhood adversity, that they have experienced these traumatic experiences early on, is what increases the risks of these associated, you know, conditions. It's not the type of adversity, because our survival mechanism, you know, our nervous system only recognizes, you know, that there is a perceived threat. It doesn't distinguish between different types of trauma. It just recognizes that there is a threat and responds in the only way that it knows how. And once this fight or flight response is activated in an infant, the survival response is unable to return to baseline, because the autonomic nervous system isn't matured. It can't access the evolved part of the nervous system, and it has not got this ability yet to self-regulate. And so that's why these children tend to stay in this survival mode. So what are the signs of undiagnosed trauma? Now, we mentioned at the beginning of this video some universal signs, but there are numerous indicators that there is unresolved trauma in the body. The nervous system, you know, certainly as we've shown with early and developmental trauma, the nervous system will shut down early on, which leaves these children to adapt to life with minimal access to the deactivated state, and minimal access to the potential for healing and regeneration. So in cases of severe trauma, so we're talking about things like abuse or military service, the flashbacks and uncontrollable anger that we see with PTSD are often evident. But, you know, as we said, trauma can also certainly be exhibited in various medical conditions. So, if we look at the signs and symptoms of unresolved trauma, there are physical and emotional problems, there are sort of social problems, and there are issues that we see just with our own individual sort of productivity and how we move forward in life. So if we first address the physical and emotional issues, we tend to see high rates of heart disease, obesity, chronic fatigue syndrome, osteoarthritis, digestive disorders such as ulcerative colitis and Crohn's, irritable bowel, osteoporosis, fibromyalgia, chronic pain in general. We will see certainly higher levels of depression and anxiety. There's a higher tendency to fall into addictive behaviours, and that could be any type of addiction. There may be insomnia or possibly sleep apnea. Anorexia nervosa can also be a big issue, and it's sort of often seen as that one way that we can sort of control what's happening in our life. And the same goes for sort of things like self-harming. adrenal fatigue, and that's because we've constantly got these high levels of stress hormones, and the body just can't cope with that long term. We will see obviously low self-esteem, low self-worth, feelings of sort of hopelessness and helplessness, and also actually susceptibility to certain types of cancers, particularly breast cancer and melanoma, have also been linked to unresolved trauma. In terms of relationships, we often find that with unresolved trauma, we fall into this kind of repetitive cycle of toxic relationships. We are unable to set clear boundaries or to, communicate effectively, to be able to express ourselves. So we may find that we have difficulty being intimate and sort of feeling a real deep love for other people or for ourselves. We may even have no desire at all to connect or bond with others, and we may struggle to feel or demonstrate any kind of empathy. This may affect our bonding capabilities if we become parents ourselves. And we also, there's a very common symptom is that we will quite often be mid-sentence and we'll just suddenly go blank and completely forget what we were saying. And that can potentially also affect our sort of ability to communicate in a relationship, or affect us, in our everyday sort of work life. In terms of productivity, we can find that we are resistant to change. We procrastinate and we overthink things to the point where we really struggle to make any kind of decision to be able to move forward. We get these mental blocks. We might have scattered thoughts and trouble focusing on things. We may have a lack of drive and purpose. We may feel uninspired, unmotivated, and while we may have this need for constant perfection, we may then fear failure. We may also fear success, because that might mean that things change. We may feel that we're never going to be good enough. We may have problems asking for help, problems saying no. We, obviously a big one with PTSD, we tend to dissociate. So then, in our work life, it could come across like we're almost not bothered, So there's all of these different symptoms, and there's going to be more than even what I've sort of just talked about. And everyone's going to be affected in different ways. The problem is that different traumas, will come from different sources. So untreated trauma is going to take many forms. Just as, a certain life event may not seem that traumatic on the surface. So the survival stress may not be immediately obvious, on its own. Someone going through, maybe a house move. Yeah, it's a bit stressful, but, everyone does it, it may not seem that much of an issue. But if you combine that in someone, if you combine it with, a divorce at the same time, maybe a loss of job, health problems, all of these things can build up into a much bigger picture. So, repeated even subtle stresses can be more difficult to overcome than the bigger stresses, because it has this cumulative effect and we don't always realize how much of an effect it's having on us until, of course, there's this whole big thing going on with multiple factors involved. And these, sort of accumulative stresses really become very much integrated into our lives and our, behaviours. Just as, again, if we look at sort of physical muscle tension, it's those sort of overuse injuries, those repetitive compensatory tensions that build up without us barely even knowing it's there. And it's only when it reaches a certain level that suddenly we're like, this is a real big problem. And it's, by that point, it's much harder to kind of resolve that problem. And it's the same thing with trauma. So we're now going to talk about 5 common signs of repressed trauma. So these are things that, if you're also a therapist, you may recognize in your clients. Maybe if they're not aware that they're even suffering with trauma, you may pick up on these things just through normal conversation with your clients. Or if it's a friend of yours, you may, recognize these symptoms and then be able to kind of build the picture of what's going on with, someone you know. So the first one of these common symptoms is resistance. Now, when we become stuck in the survival response, we often feel unable to move forward or get things done because we're constantly overthinking everything, unable to make decisions. So we kind of stay stuck. Now, the usual way that we can combat this resistance is to use behavior change strategies, setting routines in our life, being answerable to external motivational forces. So, for example, this is why a lot of people find it easier to stick to an exercise program if they have a personal trainer, because they've got that external force to kind of push them along. However, the freeze response in the autonomic nervous system, which results in that inability to move forward, that lack of drive, staying stuck in the situation you're in, that's a lot more difficult to overcome because it actually takes up a lot more space in our overall physiology. And so it will always, because of that, it will always surpass higher brain function and brain-based strategies such as goal setting, which is why, we often have to kind of repeatedly set new goals to try and overcome this. External motivators may not be successful because, we constantly need these new tactics to, just to get things done. And the second common sign is where people will, they'll have a really healthy diet, they'll, do lots of exercise, they'll have a really healthy lifestyle, but they're still unwell. And people with unresolved trauma often suffer with these chronic health issues that we've talked about. They may struggle to lose weight despite regularly exercising and eating healthily. And this is because our physiological system is stuck in that freeze response. And so our systems aren't functioning as effectively as they should, meaning that we may have a slower metabolism, we may have insufficient oxygenation at a cellular level, meaning that our energy stores are locked down due to this constant state of danger. So this means that that primitive part of the autonomic nervous system, is always going to come out on top, you know, no matter how many healthy behaviours you have. The third sign is anxiety and fear without any sort of obvious reason. So when our minds are constantly dealing with this freeze response, constant anxiety, fear, panic, no amount of positive thinking, you know, or behavioural strategies or routines or goal setting seem to help, because the autonomic nervous system is still fighting this perceived threat and it can't see past that. So these survival patterns will continue. And when the body tries to release this stored stress, we're going to start to experience certain bodily sensations. We're going to, you know, and anyone who's been through panic attacks will, you know, be familiar with this. So it could be that we have a sort of a tightness in the throat. We may get butterflies in our stomach. We may feel like we don't have enough air, like we can't breathe. We may feel a bit kind of spaced out, feeling nothing in our sort of immediate surroundings and awareness. We may feel constantly on edge, constantly like something's about to happen, but we don't know what. We may feel unable to connect with our internal you know, body environment. We may get a racing heart rate. All of these things that can really sort of make you feel a lot of fear. It can be extremely overwhelming, and you know, those of you again that have had a panic attack will know, you know, it can feel like you're having a heart attack. It's that, you know, serious. But if we don't understand how traumatic stress is released through the body, you know, we're gonna fear sort of having all these really intense sensations. And so what happens is that the stress then gets buried even deeper, which just puts us around in this stress cycle, you know, even more, because it's just going to perpetuate all these unhealthy behaviours and medical conditions and responses. So this is where massage is so great, because it can help to bring more connection, more sensation back into the body. It can help to start to regulate that nervous system. And so for those people who have unresolved trauma, who are dissociated, who are living in this sort of disembodied reality, it can really help them start to heal, start to release all this buried stress, you know, and regulate that stress cycle. Another sign, another common indicator is toxic relationships and self-sabotage. So we see time and time again that people with unresolved trauma fall into this pattern of toxic relationships, because when we're stuck in this survival response, we don't judge situations correctly. We don't necessarily see that something is a safe environment or a dangerous environment. We don't have that good, healthy gut instinct. And so we're unable to set boundaries, we're unable to say no, and we participate in these risky or addictive behaviours. And if our body only knows perceived threat, because we're constantly in this stress cycle, it just becomes, we lose that capacity to accurately perceive a dangerous situation. We may not pick up on those signals early on in a relationship that this could be someone who might be aggressive and abusive. And so we can't judge that safe environment correctly. And, you know, when we can't trust our own instincts, social, romantic, and even our relationship with ourselves will become toxic. Because we won't be able to express ourselves or to be able to make decisions and move forward. And this, you know, not even just in relationships, this can affect us in our careers. We can self-sabotage opportunities, you know, that could help us move forward in our life. And of course, we've talked about chronic health conditions. You know, we've seen a lack of energy and inability to regenerate can lead to, you know, all these various both physical and mental health conditions, even when doctors don't seem to be able to diagnose anything. And often the reason they can't diagnose anything is because they're probably unaware of the trauma, or they may be uninformed about the effects of trauma on the body. So this is why people then end up getting labelled as a hypochondriac, because they're going for all these tests and they're constantly seeing their GP and they're saying, well, I've still got this problem, or, you know, and the doctor's not seeing any reason, so they're just thinking, well, it's all in their head. You know, so unless you have a doctor who understands about dysregulation of the nervous system and who is informed about the fact that you have been through trauma and the impact that this is having on your bodily systems, then you may well, you know, continue to have health issues that are undiagnosed. But by, you know, being able to heal this nervous system dysregulation, you know, our healing responses and our immune function will be increased, which means that recurrence of these chronic conditions, you know, will be hopefully reduced or maybe even prevented. Now, the survival response does have its uses. You know, I realise you're probably listening to this and thinking, well, God, you know, this is just like bad for our physiology. It does have its uses, you know, when there is a real threat, you know, it's there to protect us, you know, and to help us get through that trauma. But it must be deactivated when that threat is no longer there, so that we return to a baseline level and the system can reset itself, and then we can just continue with our lives in a healthy way, and then next time something stressful happens, we respond to it in a healthy way. And as long as this happens, that, you know, we can self-regulate, but if particularly in our early years, you know, when our environment wasn't safe or regulated, our ability to regulate is substandard because that autonomic nervous system hasn't matured, and so we remain at that high, you know, level of the stress response, and you know, our bodies can only deal with maintaining this survival mode for so long, and so that's when the freeze response takes over. The freeze response, which is part of the parasympathetic nervous system, will take over because the sympathetic nervous system can just no longer cope with these high levels. And so this parasympathetic nervous system then takes over to keep us protected from perceived threats. Now, it may be that any threats in the future are real threats, but quite often it may just be the way that we're perceiving it. So there are various physiological responses that happen when we go into shock, which are actually very useful in preserving our tissues, in numbing our minds to what's going on, to help us deal with that experience. But of course, when they become a constant way of life, when you're constantly stuck in this survival mode, as much as these instincts and these mechanisms were protective and helpful to us, they can equally become very destructive very quickly. And so when the body goes into shock, usually the main physiological responses that happen at that time are that the heart rate will slow, the blood pressure will drop, chemicals will be released to help cope with pain, the blood will all move towards the core to protect those vital organs, to make sure that we survive. And this is why when we go into shock following a trauma, this is why we have pale skin, because the blood supply has, you know, moved inward. But it's never going to be possible to completely remove stress from someone's life. But if we can find a way to deal with it without becoming stuck in this fight or flight or freeze response, and without constantly sort of having these physiological responses to shock, then we can progressively start to self-regulate. We can start to heal, so that we can move forward. Now, this doesn't mean that the survival responses will no longer arise. They will, but it just means that we will become better at deactivating following a stressful event. You know, so we won't, this survival mode will not be a permanent sort of fixture in our life. We will deactivate and we will return to baseline, and we will carry on in a healthy way. But how do we get to this point? How do we start to reprogram our nervous system so that we can heal? Well, easy said than done. And it is going to be a very slow process. One, we have to improve our awareness and our sort of psychoeducation. We have to learn what the signs of stress are in our own bodies. We have to be able to recognize those physiological cues when our mind is kind of dismissing them. And, you know, certainly we have to recognize that what is going on physiologically in our internal environment is often a much more accurate indicator of our own conscious awareness or our behavior. So if we look at memories of a traumatic event, our memories fall into two categories. You've got explicit or declarative memories, which are where you remember an event, you remember explicit details of what happened. And then you've got your implicit or procedural memories, and this is where, particularly with trauma, you don't have the tools to be able to process that event. So the protective mechanisms are still trying to complete inside the body. And this is where we get things like numbing. We suppress those memories. This is why people, particularly with early and developmental trauma, quite often will grow up seemingly okay because they've repressed, they've numbed themselves to it, they've repressed those memories, and they kind of go out of their conscious awareness. But then years later, just something can happen, and suddenly all these emotions that have been unresolved, that are stored in their subconscious, come out into the open, and it's very difficult to then deal with that. So trauma is not only in the conscious memory, but it's stored deep down in the body's tissues. And so this is where we need to educate ourselves. We need to become more aware of our own bodies so that we can feed our brain the right information, so that the brain can then override what is going on in the nervous system, and so that the brain can then heal at a nervous system level, so that when we then enter survival mode again, or even if we're stuck in survival mode, it's the brain that will start to take over, and that will start to respond to stressful events in a more, a more rational and healthy way. And by developing our own self-awareness, how we orientate ourselves internally, how we connect with our internal body environment, but also our environmental awareness and how we relate to our surrounding environment. And as we improve how we connect with our own bodies, we become more aware of tension, we become more aware of those impulses in our body, and gradually we will learn how to feel those impulses and how to follow our impulses, again, so that we can respond to stressful events in a healthy way. So by tapping into our internal physiology, we can recognize what it is that it's trying to tell us. But as we said, we also need to kind of recognize things in our external environment as well. Another way that we can start to reprogram the brain is through our social connections, through our support network and our community. Those of us who have a proper social structure and a support network that helps to cushion us from further stress. Those people will heal from trauma and be able to self-regulate much quicker and more easily than those who are without that support network. So positive social impact experiences will impact on the sort of social portion of the parasympathetic nervous system, which allows us then to further connect to others, which is going to sort of start to create this cycle, this positive cycle, which will help us at a physiological level, helping to self-regulate the heart rate and the blood pressure when it senses stress, and helping to improve our coping mechanisms, reduce our depression and anxiety. And if we don't have this social network, then we're much more likely to fall into that survival mode pattern. And then, as we know, our, physical and mental health then suffers. So by understanding our stress physiology, and understanding what it is that our body needs, we gradually kind of undergo this internal shift in how we connect with, how we follow those impulses. And this can be things like the impulses we get through our autonomic nervous system that tells a muscle to contract. you know, all of these sort of automatic body responses. And if we're, you know, if we're going to heal the stress response, if we're going to heal sort of this dysregulation in our body systems, then we have to be able to identify and feel this stress, feel the emotions, feel, you know, the body's reactions, and therefore by doing this we address the source of that stress response in the primitive area of the autonomic nervous system. And there are a few different areas where we can start to sort of recognize these impulses and start to feel and identify these stress responses. So you've got the kidney and adrenal interface. You know, the adrenal gland secretes cortisol and adrenaline, those stress hormones, as part of the stress response. So if this is in constant activation, eventually this is going to cause burnout. So if you're experiencing that, that should tell you something about what's going on in your body. The gut-brain interface, that is a common one in trauma victims and people that I see with PTSD. And this is why a lot of people with PTSD also suffer with things like IBS, because you've got the vagus nerve, which assists with complex digestive processes. And so if that is in a state of dysregulation, we then get these digestive dysfunctions, these digestive conditions arising. So it's important, again, you know, to listen to your body, identify the signals. You know, a lot of people with IBS will tell you, you know, if you're not handling stress very well, because quite often IBS is controlled by stress rather than by food. And you know, you may think you're dealing with stress, but then you may find, you know, you're suddenly having a lot of those symptoms. So you're suddenly finding yourself cramping and running to the loo, and that could be a sign that maybe you're not dealing with stress as well as you thought you were. So it's recognizing these physiological indicators. And also, of course, the brain stem and the upper spine. The autonomic nervous system automatically orientates towards the core structures of the body to protect us in survival mode. So by working on these areas in a non-intrusive way, you know, during things such as massage treatments, is also important in overcoming the stress response. Now, another way that we can improve our ability to heal is, we sort of mentioned that briefly, is by really feeling the discomfort, feeling these emotions that you've suppressed, feeling your fears, remembering and experiencing past traumatic events is common as we start to understand the survival stress response. This may include fight, flight or freeze reactions, because maybe those reactions weren't a safe option at the time of the initial trauma, hence why we froze and disconnected from our environment and from our bodies. And so we have to start, as part of the healing process, to feel these emotions, to allow them to come up, and to find a way to gradually release these emotions as they surface in a manageable fashion, so that we can start to process it, get rid of this buried stress, and deactivate the stress response. And as we do that, you know, our autonomic nervous system will gradually start to reset itself. Now, what is a manageable means to, release these emotions? So it could be through what's known as pendulation and titration. So it could be moving from that sort of triggered state, maybe flashback mode, that high state of arousal, to a state of calm. It's finding something that will allow you to enter that state of calm. It's about feeling what is pleasant, but also feeling what is painful. Because unless we feel that, we can't process it and move on. It's allowing those feelings to come in, and just to find a way to naturally let it go, and not let it take over. It's learning how to deal with anger and aggression in a healthy way. It could be something, I don't know, like taking up boxing, just a way to get that aggression out. And just sort of having that safety network, that support system, that allows you to release those emotions in a healthy way, and in a trusting environment. And so as we increase our capacity to have good social connections, to be able to relate to others, to be able to understand our own stress physiology, we can then process these triggers much more quickly. We can identify our stress, identify those emotions, deal with them, and move on. Release them from our system so that we can move on without sort of feeling blocked, without being stuck in this survival mode, without continuing these patterns of avoidance or dissociation. And our capacity will further develop as we become more aware, as we as we use our bodies more, as we connect with our heart, as we connect with our emotions, we will release tension and therefore expand our the energy flow around our diaphragm, because the diaphragms are also very important. And again, quite often in clients with PTSD or trauma, I will often see a lot of diaphragmatic tension. The diaphragm, the main diaphragm, helps us to breathe, but alongside other diaphragms in the body, and there is a theory that there are 5 diaphragms in the body. These diaphragms are thought to contain a lot of unprocessed emotions, and so survival stress and unprocessed emotions then cause these diaphragms to become contracted, which can contribute, as we know, to increased anxiety, physical pain, shallow breathing. So by working on these diaphragmatic areas individually, and also working on the systems that work between them, we can also help to release old stress and create a higher capacity to manage our stress more effectively. So I'm not going to go into really any detail, but some of you are probably thinking 5 diaphragms, you know, you might only have known of 1 or 2. So the 5 diaphragms are the tentorium cerebelli, the tongue, the thoracic outlet, the thoracic diaphragm, which is that one under the ribs, and the pelvic floor. So obviously if you want to know more about that, then you know, look it up. So to summarize, you know, one of the main effects of early and developmental trauma is that knowing, not knowing what internal safety feels like, not having that baseline level. And so when this happens, building the capacity, building those right practices, those healthy coping mechanisms will take a lot longer. And so healing, you know, and starting to feel these emotions can be particularly overwhelming and particularly painful, because these people didn't have a solid nervous system to start with. And so if you're a therapist treating someone who's been through early and developmental trauma, you've really got to be extra cautious, because you do not want to open them up to their survival stress before they have the capacity to handle what is to come. And so that's probably the biggest precaution that you need to take as a therapist. And if you're someone who's seeking something like massage therapy to deal with unresolved trauma and to try and build your capacity, that's something to be aware of as well. You know, if you reach a point where you are starting to release emotions and you're starting to struggle to deal with that, make sure that you communicate with your therapist so that, you know, the treatment can happen at a rate that is manageable for you. And that's really important, because, you know, if you go at too fast a pace, it can actually put you back a step. So I think that's probably everything I can say about the physiology behind trauma. There is so much more that you can learn about this. Polyvagal theory is a whole other area that I'm not going to go into now, but do look that up as well if you want to kind of develop your knowledge further. But yeah, that's really it from me. Do subscribe to my channel. As I say, do take a look at those other videos on PTSD, domestic abuse, Yoni massage and neurogenic tremors. They're also linking with this subject. Feel free to comment down below. You can contact me through my Instagram or Facebook. I will come back to you if you have any questions. But that's really all from me for now. So I hope this has helped you at least start to understand the stress response that you may be going through, and how to move forward. But for now, take care, and I'll see you next time.